Director of Arts Engine here at the University of Michigan and of the National Organization Alliance for the Arts and Research Universities. Generally speaking, this is what we'll be looking at today. I want to kind of give you all a tour of what this looks like, what you guys are doing, and the context that it exists in nationally, but also how it manifests at a lot of our peer institutions and what that means for how we approach knowledge making, which is too important for any one set of methodologies to have, to call it their own territory, exclusively anyway. So I'll take you through this kind of an argument about something that I've been calling the creative turn, how it manifests here at the University of Michigan, how it's manifesting across the country, and what the main challenges are that face this kind of knowledge production. All right, so what is the creative turn? Well, the reason I have been calling it this creative turn is that it really encapsulates a lot of different attempts to combine the ways that we know from the sciences and the ways that we do and the ways that we know from the arts. So it manifests in a lot of different ways, right? We've seen in the last 10 or 15 years a lot of emphasis on design thinking. Classes like this and the kind of talks that you've heard today and you'll continue to hear represent this art science collective. There's also a STEM to STEAM movement that I'm sure you've all heard about, right? There's more of the kind of work that we do with A2RU that is focused on art-centric interdisciplinarity and how we bring the full kind of round peg of the arts to the square holes of the sciences. Also, a lot more increased arts practices being embedded in other fields more and more and more, and even things like the maker movement that are far less formal, right, and kind of becoming formal. I would argue that all of these are, in some ways, overlapping attempts, waves, right, in the same storm, surges that could be called the cultural turn. The creative turn. The reason that, if you know anything about these, you may know that not all these camps kind of play nicely together, right? There are competing interests, and because many of them are going for the same territory, some of them have the same people involved, and that can be tumultuous. But really the big context that I want to provide here is that in the late 60s and early 70s, we went through a period in higher education that we could later call the cultural turn. And it represents a number of shifts in how we approached knowledge in the sciences and the arts, and particularly in the humanities. And this is when we saw the birth of things, like, in any real sense, like women's studies or Chicano and Latino studies, African and African American studies. It also threw a bunch of traditional fields into crisis, right? So anthropology took a cultural turn. And instead of it being thought of within the terms of civilization, it was forced to look at itself, at its own self, as being culturally biased in anthropology. So this social science had a crisis of identity, and it's still trying to reckon with this, right? And there are all these overlapping different manifestations at that moment that defined a whole different wave in higher education, and it informs the way that we live daily life now. With it's daily life is subject to the same things that higher education is, and vice versa. So think about your own lives and the way that we talk about things in popular culture, right? And that Hermione Granger is now like a women's ambassador for the UN or something. That wouldn't have happened if it weren't for this cultural turn, right? And then Victoria Beckham got jealous, and now she's with she's with some U.S. aid organization now. It's crazy, right? But we see the same kinds of things happening structurally, right? The cultural turn, now we have the creative turn. And they have different outcomes and goals, right? The cultural turn is where we started seeing a real kind of consolidation and coalescing of the skills that we now call creative thinking. I'm sorry, I'm skipping ahead of myself. Critical thinking, right? Critical thinking skills. We talk about them all the time. They try to develop them as best they can in the K-12 system, and we try to hone them and give them real context and meaning in higher education. that became a normal practice out of the cultural turn. Before that, it was more vocational, right? And it was still within a liberal arts framework, but a bit more vocational. We're starting to see the same thing now, with all of these things making up this creative turn. And it's symbolic of a shift in values, essentially. All right, so what are those values? What matters? And who gets to decide what matters? Well, the idea is, and I think most of you would agree, but I'd love to chat with you about it in a little while here, that creativity belongs to all disciplines. Biologists need to be creative. They need to be able to link the minutia, a data point or a shift in some variable, with the larger picture, the context in which their research takes place. The same thing's true of an artist. The same thing's true of someone who writes in prose, as it is for a painter or anyone else, right? Or a professional flautist. But the idea is that it's all about executing visions, right? And whether you execute that vision with the methodologies of the sciences, where you set up a study and you have all the knowledge up front, or if you execute that vision where the variables are changing. And I use the term variables loosely here. I mean what matters to you at that moment as you are making and kind of iterating your way forward gets to be part of the project. Different ways of knowing and doing and executing visions. So the idea here is that although you can never really separate, especially in the arts, the products of your labor from the process of how you got there, I do think that we can expand what we mean by the final product to be many different kinds of things. And therefore, the processes that are endemic to the arts, the habits of work, and the various skills that encompasses, can be brought to bear on virtually any field in a meaningful way. So some of those skill sets include things like comfort with ambiguity, right? Not necessarily knowing what the intended outcome will be when one just starts doing. Negotiating your own intent with critiques. This is a real skill set, right? This is a real thing. I have had friends and colleagues that are engineers, for example, and engineers have a very hard time accepting critique because it is either right or it is wrong. But it could be right-er, right? But then you also, for example, we offer in Arts Engine, we have a couple of courses. One is UArts 250, it's called Creative Process, and it's co-taught by 4 faculty members, one from each of the colleges on North Campus. So there's an engineer, someone from Art and Design, someone from the School of Music, Theater, and Dance, and someone from Architecture and Urban Planning. And sometimes, as students are working on these projects, the professors will give them conflicting advice, intentionally. And then a student has to decide for herself, whose advice do I take, if I take anyone's? And then how do I articulate why I took one or the other or neither, right? What does that mean for my own process as a maker, right? As someone who's making. Another way that both of these things lead into this idea of iteration and self-mastery. There's this kind of wonderful, and I hate this word, but plucky, quote from Mark Twain, which I'm going to totally slaughter. He says something like, "History does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme." And I found that very intriguing because I think what he's trying to say, and he's talking about this over centuries, but really we could even look at it in our own processes and how we approach the same task or the same thing that we're making over and over and over again. You can't come back to it with the same frame of mind that you did even a moment earlier, right? We all experience life. We make in context. We research in context. Our artworks, our research all exists in a world. And we are always confirming or challenging the various identities and the truths, the ground truths for you engineers out there, that we're depending on, right? And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Finally, next, embracing failure, this idea of failure, right? Collaborative and interdisciplinary work, of course. And not just creative problem solving, but creative problem finding. I mean, who gets to decide what matters? Again, who decides? What information? How long do you stay somewhere before you define a problem? Right? And I found this actually when I was teaching writing for a while, like your classes at Sweetland or wherever you get your writing requirements done. You know, whenever I would assign a research paper of some kind, there was this moment when students would be researching and researching and researching and writing their way through the research, right? And they would realize they'd get very disheartened because they would have to abandon the original question, right? Because they knew more at that point, and that original container of the question no longer pertained. And that's actually a kind of a wonderful moment where you either fully collapse and get mad, or you actually find interest and you go deep, right? And you reframe what it means based on what you know. And it's a very uncomfortable moment, right? You have to get comfortable with ambiguity. But that's part of the process. And of course, formulating a vision and executing it. That's really what we're talking about, no matter what that vision is or what methods you use to execute it. All right, so just a little bit about local stuff here. What I do, what we do, what I do with my colleague Michelle back there in the corner. Arts Engine is a body here. Again, it's supported by and it belongs to all 4 North Campus colleges. But we have lots of partnerships down on Central Campus as well. We drive interdisciplinary work, mostly curricula, research, and various co-curricular initiatives. So student groups come to us all the time, and they're like, hey, we have a crazy idea. And the answer is yes, if it is something that includes that and, where people aren't choosing between the sciences or technology or the arts. It's that space, the Mandorla, as this class puts it, that we, especially if it can transform the rest of those circles that we try to support and push here. And we are known as a national leader. The University of Michigan on the whole, certainly through Arts Engine, but also through its various other offerings and aspects, which I'll mention in a little bit. I noted that we have a couple of courses, UArts 150 and 250. 150 is mostly tied to the Living Arts, Living Learning program, if you've ever heard of Living Arts. That's something we do. 250 is open to anybody. We also have an annual competition called 42 Hours of Recreativity. This time around, it's going to be a month from right now, actually, the 24th through the 26th of October. And I'll talk more about that in just a second. Leah had mentioned the Alliance for the Arts and Research Universities, which was founded here at the University of Michigan, that I'm involved with, and we also have our ongoing research project. All right, so this idea of 42 hours of recreativity, right? The idea is, it is a competition in creative reuse. Interdisciplinary student teams design, plan, and execute a product or work that reuses commonly discarded materials in innovative ways. This year, it's a wearables competition. So wearable computing, wearable artworks, clothing, fashion, whatever, right? Whatever. It doesn't have to be marketable. It doesn't have to be an artistic expression. Whatever, if you can find a way, do it. Teams equal undergraduate or graduate students plus a faculty advisor. It's not that hard to secure, and there are cash prizes. Some of the coolest ones that I can recall in recent memory, this one came in third, I think. It's a wedding dress made out of solo cups, a stack of foam plates. There is, for those of you who know anything about even basic electronic or electrical engineering, little Arduino machines that you can control things. Someone made essentially spinning pieces on this dress that moved and altered their shape, programmed it. And there's also lights. And now here's the great part. This is a team that was made up of women from engineering, from art and design, and from women's studies and sociology. And it's just a really neat mix right then and there. But the idea is that, you know, in contemporary culture, the wedding dress is something that traditionally, at least in the United States, you kind of keep forever, right? So they have this juxtaposition, right? This is the artistic component where there's something that you keep forever that's made out of completely discarded materials, right? So it's that permanence and impermanence simultaneously that has some effect, I think. Another version this year was a team had a mechanical engineer, I want to say a student from music, theater, and dance, and a couple of students from LS&A that I can't recall their majors. And they bought a piano. They bought, you know, on Craigslist or whatever for like $200. And they decided that they were going to use the piano as raw materials to create new instruments. And they did. They hacked it up, they restrung it, they found pitches that worked, and composed music for it. And all this happens in a 42-hour period, right? And it's just like marathon time. And that same year, there was the team that won is, again, I think a mechanical engineer and a few others, maybe from some people from art and design and some other folks, who created they took cardboard, discarded cardboard, and they created a particular like lattice structure that was very lightweight and strong and foldable like an accordion. And you know, of the 7 or so billion people on the planet, about 2 billion sleep on mats, right, like a roll-up mat. Well, in many parts of the world, sleeping on a mat is very dangerous because of animals or disease and various other, you know, perhaps not great sanitation, that sort of thing. So this collapsible, lightweight cardboard lattice structure, which costs about 17 cents per major piece, could support human weight and could easily be manufactured and distributed to people around the world. So it took a design and an artistic sensibility, right? Like to rethink what it means to have a bed or a mat. Like, no, we need to abandon the models that we know, and we need to come up with something new, right? And execute this vision. And they did, right? And I don't know if they ever pursued it as a thing, but I really hope they did. Anyway, it was a shameless plug. A2RU, the national body that Leah mentioned, partnership of 30 top-tier research universities, really trying to embed this kind of work institutionally. So here's the deal. Apparently, and this was news to me when I started the research a few years back, the kind of work that we're talking about, all those overlapping fields that I mentioned earlier that are kind of make the creative turn, they've really been part and parcel of teaching in higher education and faculty research and, you know, industry for a good 15 years, in some cases up to 40 or 50 years. And the structures of universities move really slow. They're like glacial, right? Like when we think about the majors or really the college structures that existed within universities, that stuff stopped changing in like 1900, right? Now there's some cool majors that they've thrown in, but like the structures are grinding slow. So we have this really pragmatic challenge. How do we change the institutional nature to support the kind of work that's already been going on there? And it's surprisingly difficult and complicated. As I think I noted, most of these major universities have colleges of engineering or the arts, design, or some other combination thereof that kind of support and participate heavily in this. And I should note that we had our very first student conference, which is not so much a conference as like kind of like a scaled up national version of that 42 hours of recreativity competition I mentioned, with 3 to 5 students from each of the 30 institutions. We all showed up at Stanford. We did like a boot camp in the D school, and it was hardcore challenge time. come up with, find a grand problem with people from whatever discipline, from wherever in the country, make a solution, propose it, present it. Because it's important that we actually have the ability to speak about these things, not just do them. And I should mention that the one that we have coming up is going to be at Virginia Commonwealth University in February, end of January, early February. And you should all apply to represent the University of Michigan. And then there's the research that Leah mentioned that I've been conducting. So let me just apologize right now for the amount of text on these slides. It's like cardinal rule number one, and I hate it when I am sitting where you're sitting and a presenter's like, look at all my text. So my bad, I understand, sorry. It's a lot of information. You don't need to know every single thing. The idea is that over the course of 3 years, we've been gathering tons of data in the form of interviews that we've recorded and I've been analyzing. So far, we visited 37 universities across the country and some in the UK. We've already collected 725. By the end of December, actually the end of November, we'll have over 1,000 interviews with deans, directors, faculty, students like yourselves, presidents, provosts of universities, all trying to figure out how to make these practices, these very common things that happen at all universities, part of the culture in a sustained way. I should also note, getting back to that Mark Twain quote about history not repeating itself but rhyming, the movement that I'm noting, this creative turn, is really distinctly a US phenomenon right now. And that's because it already happened elsewhere. But it's not the same thing, right? It happened differently somewhere else. and it's happened several times in between. It's sort of like, how do I say this? So in Turkey, for example, cell phone technology in Turkey is way better than it is in the United States. Okay, and that's because Turkish folks have been using cell phones to pay their bills, to not just do social media, but to operate in regular life for longer than that's been common in the United States. Why? Well, that's because in the United States, we have laptops, and people can generally afford, the citizenry got into laptops at a certain moment. That didn't take off in Turkey. So desktops, cell phones. Cell phones had to be better earlier, right? You can make the same analogy with other kinds of technologies and cultural values and economics and other situations as well. Same thing's true here. For the last 40 years or so, especially in the UK and parts of Western Europe, but certainly in other parts of the world, I know the most about Europe and Australia in this particular context, but I'm sure elsewhere as well, their governments support this kind of work. There's a heavy emphasis on design and on the arts, and there's a long history of cultural policy. Not so in the United States, not in the same way at least. We have different kinds of problems. Now the thing is, this sort of leapfrogging effect, in Europe, it's very much tied to creative industry policy, those sorts of things. Here, it manifests very differently, but it's sort of like it rhymes, but it's not repeating, right? It's a different animal altogether. All right, so some of the findings. This is where it gets cool. So thanks for permitting me to talk about Arts Engine for a while. These are some of the models that we've come up with. A great faculty member in art and design, John Marshall, mentioned this kind of infusion, diffusion model, and we've adapted it as a way of thinking about this. But this is really where the title of my talk comes in as well. So when we think about partnerships, or the ways that disciplines and the methods that define them meet and change each other. We've identified 3 different ways that this happens, and I'll start down here and then I'll go up there. One is infusion, right, where elements of the arts practices, methodologies, experiences, right, various demonstrations and illustrations, examples, are used to illuminate another kind of knowledge, most notably technological and scientific knowledge. The opposite is diffusion. Disciplinary defined arts and or design practices are offered to or for non-majors or scholars from outside the arts, right? So arts training for people who are not themselves artists. I should say that this goes the other direction too, as I think you probably heard last week. You know, if a painter has a better knowledge of chemistry, right, that's scientific knowledge and information that will change the way that she paints, theoretically at least. So let me give you an example of what I mean. This is really what I would call the ally function, right, where, you know, painting doesn't change, right? That field, painting doesn't change because she knows chemistry, right? Or, well, I'll show you what I mean. So, this is a video where high definition microscopy, right? So the biologists in here, you're welcome. But the transformations in lens technology and all of this, it's responding to the needs of photography and the arts, right? So these new technologies that are spurred because of the arts get used so that we can understand and see elements of, in this case, a honeybee, I think. By the way, that's an eyeball. That is a furry eyeball. No, thank you. Right? And now we have a tomato stem and leaf. The stinging nettle. I'm so sorry to hear that. If you found this in your room, I'd be really freaked out. Because I think you have to go to like the bottom of the ocean for that. But falcon feathers, right? So here's the deal. You get the idea. This is how it becomes an ally, in that just because biologists now have that tool doesn't mean that biology is changed, right? It's a technology. It hasn't changed the basis of how you know. It didn't change the scientific method, right? It gave a new tool to use, right? So that's an ally, right? And that's how I would also think about interdisciplinarity. There are lots of different definitions out there. It's one of the questions we've asked all 700 and whatever interviewees. How do you define interdisciplinarity? And you know, interdisciplinarity to me is where different methods, different disciplines come together and achieve something that they otherwise couldn't, right? And they each take something away, but it doesn't necessarily fundamentally change or transform the fields. I would use the word transdisciplinary to describe that process, right? So normally inter would mean within. Trans, you know, generally speaking means across. But to me, the trans in transdisciplinary is really about transformation. And then you get new fields that emerge out of these things, right? A really good example would be something like robotics, right? Not just a mechanical engineering feat, not just computer science and engineering feat at all. It's a very aesthetic process where, like, what would you do if a robot looked way too human? Right? There's such a thing as a robot looking too human, I think. Would you agree or disagree with that? Like, that would freak me out, right? Like, I don't know if you ever saw AI, like, no. But what if it looks too robotic? You can't relate to it, right? So there's like a perfect level. There's a Goldilocks zone of human-lookingness for robots. Another good example would be something like computational journalism, which is a field. You can go get a degree in computational journalism. That is something that definitely changed after 1900. All right, and that's also what I mean by fusion, these alloys, right, where components come together and something new emerges, an alloy in this case. All right, so a few examples from universities across the country. This is one of our partner universities through A2RU, but another place that we visited, University of Florida. So there's a course that was dreamed up by an industrial engineer, and she was at a faculty meeting of some kind with some people from outside of her college, and she started chatting with a professor of dance. All right, so what in the world would these people have in common, one would think immediately, right? But they actually have an ongoing sustained research project that they advance together and they co-teach together. And it goes something like this. Students from the College of the Arts, where dance is housed, and students from engineering can enroll for this course. I think it might be open to anyone actually, but especially those two bodies. And in this course, they approach kind of systematic thinking from different zones. If you think about what choreography is, it's systems, it's loops, in a sense, right? And if you think about, like, anybody here a musician? Anybody have any musical skills at all? Wow, don't all go at once. That's amazing. All right, if you look at a musical score, right? It's a system, it's a language, and there's sometimes in musical scores there's a symbol at the end of a line called a coda, right? And that is a place that you will repeat back to at a certain point. All right. By the way, way more of you were nodding your head than raised your hand when you said you were not musicians, so liars. Shame on you all. All right, and then if you think about, all right, well, how about this? Does anyone here write code? Any programmers in the audience? Oh, 3. All right, 3.5. When you write a loop, okay, and you can write it horizontally or you can write it down, right? You can write it different ways. Systematic thinking, it's the same process, right? So choreography, musical scores, writing, programming. Approaching that kind of knowledge or that practice, that skill set from various ways of authorship, right? Whether it's computational and programmatic, or whether it's embodied as a dancer where you are studying it in the way you actually move yourself, right? It furthers the ways that we approach that particular kind of skill set. So I would argue that, the professors would argue that you become a better programmer by embodying that process. You become a better dancer